clarity on the day's headlines, interviews and analysis with experts on the region, and answers to the questions you have. Listen to Global News Podcast wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Live from London, this is The World Today with Maryam Moshiri. The Gazans killed as Israeli special forces rescued 2 hostages 10 days ago. We have a special report. The Middle East and the war in Ukraine dominate the agenda as G20 foreign ministers meet in Brazil. We'll take you there live. One of the UK's richest men, Sir Jim Ratcliffe, reveals to the BBC his plans for one of the world's richest football clubs as he inks a deal to co-own Man United.
You know, you do have to pinch yourself, really, because it is a sort of a boyhood dream, but they never come true normally, do they? This is the exception to the rule, and it's a nice one for me.
Also coming up on The World Today.
Throw your keys up, stick around, round, 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 round.
As Beyoncé tops the country music charts, her father tells the BBC it's always been in her blood. Hello, welcome to The World Today with me, Maryam Moshiri. We're reporting from Jerusalem, Rafah, Rio, Kiev and here in London, where the time has just gone 6 p.m. We begin, though, with the war in Gaza. Israel is now into its 4th month of military operations since the Hamas attacks on October the 7th. There's also this hour, we're expecting the British Parliament to vote on calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. These are live pictures of the debate that's been continuing throughout the afternoon in the House of Commons. Meanwhile, the Israeli Parliament earlier voted to back Prime Minister Netanyahu's declaration opposing the unilateral creation of a Palestinian state. His Likud party says 99 out of 120 members voted to support the declaration passed earlier this week by the Israeli cabinet. It comes amid growing international pressure to revive efforts to reach a 2-state solution to the decades-long conflict. But first, a special report on the number of Palestinian casualties when Israeli special forces rescued 2 of the hostages held by Hamas on February the 12th. There was relief for the families of the 2, 70-year-old Louis Har and Fernando Marman, who's 60, and there was a boost to national morale. But the raid in Rafah to free them reportedly left more than 70 people dead and dozens more wounded. Well, in a moment, we'll speak with our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams, who is in Jerusalem. But first, this report is from the BBC's special correspondent, Fergal Keane, who's been hearing the testimony of civilians and medics caught up in a night of fear.
They were rescued from here.
The 2 Israeli hostages that were kidnapped by Hamas on the massacre of October 7th are now home.
This is the story of the price paid by the civilians of Rafah on the night of February the 12th. The rescue began around 1:45 a.m. By the time the hostages were safe, more than 70 people were reported killed, a high number civilians. In this house, a doctor from Médecins Sans Frontières lay across her children to protect them. She's asked to remain anonymous. Voice messages to colleagues afterwards convey her horror.
On our home, I found pieces of human flesh. We found a whole lower limb belonged to a human that we don't know who he is. When I saw the pieces of the flesh on the floor, I cried.
Some of the wounded were brought to an international field clinic.
Bilateral amputation.
Dr. Javed Ali from Pakistan has worked here for the last 2 months.
It was very close to the hospital. The windows and the doors were rattling. It was extremely scary. All in all, we saw more than 20 patients. A lot of women and children were trying to come and seek refuge in the hospital.
It is in the stories of individual families that the impact of the raid is most painfully expressed. Nawara al-Najjar is a mum of 6 and pregnant with a 7th child. She woke after being injured by an explosion.
وصحصحت عن حالي لقيت جوزي قاعد بينازع. ولادي أول ما شافوه صار يصرخوا يا بابا يا بابا تتركناش. الذنب اللي زي هذا. الذنب الأطفال. الذنب أنا. ترملت وأنا صغيرة عمري 27 سنة.
Nawara remembers happy days with Abed al-Rahman, 32 years old, when he was killed.
قلبه طيب كتير. كان هو له فترة كان كتير يعني علاقته مع الأطفال كويسة ومعايا كويس. يقعد يحضن فيه حتى كان يمشط لهم من شعورهم للبنات. قلت يا بابا يمشط لهم حنون كتير.
Here, some of the couple's children in hospital on the night their dad died. 12-year-old Samaya, treated for minor physical wounds, but traumatized. And 13-year-old Malak, who lost her eye in the raid.
ما كانوش معالجين. قعدت فيها يمكن 3 أيام. بعد 3 أيام عملت لي العملية. صابت بعيني بصفحتي دخل فيها رصاص ما دخل وما خرج. شو ذنبي إنه يصير فيها هيك؟ وجع خسرت أبويا أنا خلاص.
Israel accuses Hamas of using civilians as human shields. In a statement to the BBC, the IDF said it was committed to mitigating civilian harm. Military lawyers advised so strikes complied with international law. Commanders analyse, take into account expected military advantage and the likely collateral harm to civilians. The war goes on. Civilians like Abed al-Rahman keep being killed. In the voice message of the MSF doctor, a sense of the despair felt here.
This message means nothing to a lot of people and will change nothing. And to be honest, the one who died is the one who's lucky. The one who lived to suffer again and again and again, who the one have been cursed and abandoned by all people.
But the memory of their father will endure for all of their lives. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Well, of course, there are still a number of hostages, Israeli hostages, still in Gaza. Let's cross live now to our World Affairs correspondent, Paul Adams, who is in Jerusalem for us. And Paul, tell me, are we any closer, do we think, to some sort of deal to get those other hostages back to Israel?
It's hard to know just how close we are, or perhaps how far we are, but for the first time in quite a few weeks, there was just a hint of optimism, and I wouldn't put it any more strongly than that, frankly, from a member of Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet, Benny Gantz. He said this evening, there are attempts these days to promote a new outline and the initial signs that indicate an intention to move forward. That doesn't sound like someone who is predicting an imminent breakthrough. But there were reports this morning in 1 or 2 of the Israeli newspapers suggesting that there was just a hint of optimism about the process. You'll recall that when Hamas issued their response to a proposed ceasefire and hostage release, the Hamas response was described by Benjamin Netanyahu as delusional. That was a week or 2 back. Since then have been intensive efforts involving the Americans and also talks in Cairo between Egyptian and Hamas officials. So there's a process going on, and Benny Gantz detects in that process perhaps just a smidgen of optimism. But I don't think anyone is predicting that this is going to happen anytime soon.
And Paul, as we mentioned earlier, the Israeli parliament has voted to back the Prime Minister Netanyahu's declaration opposing the unilateral creation of a Palestinian state. Tell me a little bit more about that. It now means a big majority for the Prime Minister's declaration.
Yes, and that was very much to be expected. We had the Prime Minister making his views on this very clear last week, the Cabinet endorsing his position, and now the Knesset by a majority of 99 out of the 120 members endorsing that position, including members of the Israeli opposition. I think there is a widespread view here that Israel is coming under pressure, including from its its strongest ally, the United States, but also other countries like Britain, to move the peace process forward and to kind of salvage something out of the mess of the Gaza war. And you've had American and British officials and others talking about the idea of individually, unilaterally recognizing a Palestinian state peace process, not at the end of it, but at some point along the road. And that is talk that alarms the Israeli government. It believes that the process should be very much the result of negotiations between the parties, but frankly there have been no negotiations for the better part of more than a decade, perhaps even 15 years or so. But it is, I think, a reflection of an Israeli political system digging in its heels and resisting any notion that Israel is going to be dictated to by anyone.
Paul Adams, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, as we mentioned earlier, in the House of Commons in Westminster, there is a debate and a vote. The vote is on whether to call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. MPs have been preparing to vote on a motion in Parliament put forward by the Scottish National Party, the SNP, calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Now, a little earlier, we saw the House Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, choose both the government and the Labour Party's amendments to the motion. That was a bit of a controversial thing to do. It breaks convention. The convention normally is not selecting opposition amendments. The vote is about to happen. We, of course, will bring you that live here on BBC News. Let's return now, though, to what's happening in Brazil, where ministers from the G20, including the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, are gathered in Rio de Janeiro for a summit, which began just over an hour ago. It's going to discuss many topics, including poverty, climate change and the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza. Well, the UK Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, is also expected to set out action against Russia in response to the death of the opposition politician Alexei Navalny last Friday. Well, let's cross live now to our South America correspondent, Ione Wells, who is in Rio for us. And Ione, talk me through what's on the agenda at the G20 this time.
Well, ministers have just sat down really for their main session today, and this is about how the G20 responds to ongoing international tensions. I think we can read from that the main topics on the agenda today will be the war in Ukraine, but also Gaza and Israel as well. Now, one of the interesting tensions that is playing out here at the moment is how the different G20 leaders are responding to Russia's actions in Ukraine. We saw Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov arrive earlier. He is sat roughly opposite the UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron in that room as they are having their meeting right now. Now, earlier today, the UK Foreign Secretary did announce further sanctions against Russia. These included freezing the assets of 6 prison bosses in the prison where Alexei Navalny died. Now, we haven't yet had a sort of response today because that meeting is still ongoing as to how, for example, other leaders in the room are responding to the UK's actions today. It's expected that the US later this week will also announce a further package of sanctions against Russia. Now, how that will kind of pan out here is that this meeting will kind of run on for a couple more hours. They are also due to discuss some other themes, though, including global governments and reform to that as well. We had some opening remarks from Brazil's foreign minister, who talked about how one of the important things about the G20 is it is one of the few spaces internationally where different countries who disagree about foreign policy can get together about some of these issues.
Interesting. Ione, thank you very much indeed. Ione Wells live for us there in Rio. Still to come on The World Today. An embarrassing episode for the UK after a test firing of a British missile designed to carry nuclear warheads fails for the second time in a row. And Russian jail chiefs face sanctions after the death of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Around the world and across the UK, this is The World Today on BBC News. Let's take a look at some other stories now making headlines globally. Nikki Haley says she won't drop out of the presidential race even if she loses in South Carolina. The Republican presidential candidate has vowed to remain in the race regardless of the outcome of Saturday's South Carolina primary, where she's badly trailing Donald Trump. In its annual economic report, Germany now predicts even slower growth than previously forecast for this year. The economy minister, Robert Habeck, says the country has been hit hard by its earlier dependence on Russian gas, its ageing population, and also the lack of skilled workers in Germany. And a livestock ship blamed for causing a foul smell that's engulfed Cape Town in South Africa is now departing for Iraq. An animal welfare group which assessed the cattle on board has described the conditions as abhorrent. The cows have been on the ship for more than 2 weeks and several have been euthanised due to the injuries they've suffered whilst being on the ship. You're watching BBC News. You're live with me, Maryam Moshiri, on The World Today. For the second time in a row, a test firing of a Trident missile from a Royal Navy submarine has failed. It was supposed to have flown several thousand miles before landing harmlessly in the Atlantic between Brazil and West Africa. Well, instead, the missile dropped into the ocean off Florida, quite close to where it was actually launched. The Ministry of Defence insists the deterrent is still effective. Here's our defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale.
This test actually took place in January, but only now have details been revealed. The missile was launched from Britain's HMS Vanguard off the coast of Florida. It was supposed to fly about 3,700 miles and land harmlessly in the sea off West Africa. Instead, the unarmed test missile hit the water close to the launch site. So what do we know about the missile itself? Its US manufacturer says it has a range of more than 4,500 miles and can carry multiple nuclear warheads, each of which can be directed towards different targets. There have been 191 successful test launches, most carried out by the US, just a dozen by the UK. And the last 2 of those UK tests have gone wrong.
Well, let's speak now to British military veteran Justin Crump. He's also CEO of defence and intelligence company Sibylline. Good to talk to you as always, Justin. Thanks for joining us. Is this an embarrassment?
It's never a good look, is it? But I would say I'm not sleeping any more restlessly at night. And given the state of the world, I think we're all sleeping a bit restlessly over the last few years. But this hasn't added to my woes. I think if you look at the record of the Trident system, it is a pretty successful system. The Russian latest weapon system, for example, has a 50% failure rate, and yet no one's saying that isn't a threat. And I think it'd be a brave person that would say that due to the couple of failures by the RN over the last 8 years, that this meant it was ineffective capability, that the UK doesn't have a nuclear capability. That would be an enormous stretch and a very, very foolish thing for anyone to assume. But it's not a good look for the RN and for defence in general, on top of some of the other things that's happened with the Royal Navy in recent months. And I think the timing of this coming out obviously is therefore more unfortunate than it might have been otherwise.
I mean, it has drawn attention, hasn't it, to the UK's nuclear capability in not a particularly positive way. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, it has. And I think also the whole maritime domain, if you like, of warfare, it is no doubt. I mean, there's far more eyes on the sea at the moment with things going on. There's far more attention on nuclear, as you say, with things going on in the world, even just in the last week or so. And for the Navy in particular, it's a service that has, as with all the armed services, it's got the motto of improvise, adapt and overcome. The armed services have done more with less year after year and are very good at tightening their belts and getting on with it. But I think what we're seeing in general shows that the pressure on the service is large. And particularly with the nuclear deterrent, we have very long at-sea patrols over the last couple of years to stretch the capability of the fleet we have at the moment. We keep one submarine at sea with warheads on it for our deterrent. They've been doing very long patrols, and it's all signs of the stretch that the armed forces are under. And again, the failure of the missile in this case doesn't worry me at all. The submarine did its job. The launch processes all went okay. That's what they were there to test. Again, not a good look, but it's not worrying me. But I think what worries me more is just the stretch on the armed forces. And scrambling our second carrier to sea was an amazing accomplishment by the people that did it. But it also shows numbers matter. The strength of your forces matter because things go wrong in warfare. It's good if you've got a backup. A Trident submarine has 15 more missiles. Again, they've got multiple warheads each. I'm not worried about that. But you've got to have the capacity for when things go wrong.
OK. Justin Crump, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Let's bring you some breaking news now. And we're hearing in the last few minutes that King Charles has met the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak face to face at Buckingham Palace. These are pictures that have just come into us here at The World Today on BBC News. The meeting happened late on Wednesday afternoon, marking the restart of their weekly encounters to talk about all matters of government. Now, of course, on the 6th of February, we heard that King Charles had been diagnosed with cancer. And at that point, we were told that meetings would be held remotely. This, however, is a sign that that's changing. King Charles has now held an in-person Privy Council at the royal residence, where we hear the attendees would have included the Lord President of the Council, Penny Mordaunt. Now, the King has, of course, been dealing throughout this time with his red boxes of state papers behind the scenes, having started that outpatient treatment for the undisclosed form of cancer just over 2 weeks ago. So there you have it. The King has met the Prime Minister face to face for the first time since that cancer diagnosis. Let's turn our attention to Russia now. We are, of course, following developments over the death of the country's main opposition figure and fierce Putin critic, Alexei Navalny. Just a few hours ago, the UK became the first country to impose fresh sanctions in response. Well, the Foreign Office said it had frozen the assets of 6 Russian prison bosses in charge of the Arctic penal colony where the opposition leader died. Here's the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
Together with our allies, we are considering all options to hold Russia and Putin to account. And this morning, we sanctioned those running the prison where Alexei Navalny's body still lies.
Well, Alexei Navalny's death in prison was announced on Friday. His family have been told his body will not be released for 2 weeks. It's being held for chemical analysis. Here's the response of Mr. Navalny's mother, speaking outside the penal colony.
The decision on the question depends only on you. Let me finally see my son. I demand you immediately hand over the body of Alexei so that I can bury him.
Well, let's remind ourselves now of who Mr. Navalny was and how we got here. His activism began with an anti-corruption blog, and by 2011 he was leading mass anti-government protests. Over the coming years, he'd find himself in and out of prison and banned from running for office. Well, in 2020, Mr. Navalny collapsed on a flight over Siberia after being poisoned by the Soviet-era nerve agent Novichok. Well, just 5 months later, after treatment in Germany, he returned to Moscow and was promptly arrested. His arrest triggered some of the biggest protests in Russia for years, with thousands detained by police. In August 2023, Mr. Navalny was found guilty of founding and funding an extremist organisation and was given an additional 19 years to serve in prison. Well, Western leaders say the blame for his death lies with the Russian authorities, including President Putin. Over the weekend, a clip from the documentary Navalny went viral. His final message to Russian people in his own words.
Если это произошло, это означает, что мы необыкновенно сильны в этот момент, раз они решили меня убить. Ну и нужно использовать эту силу. Не сдаваться. Помнить о том, что мы огромная сила.
Well, let's speak now to Boris Bondarev. He's a former Russian diplomat who recently resigned from his position because of his opposition to the war in Ukraine. It's good to talk to you, Boris. Thanks for joining us on The World Today. Let me ask you, first of all, your reaction to what has happened over the last week.
Well, it's a great loss for Russia, for Russian democratic forces, of course, and that's a tragedy, and it's another crime committed by President Putin, his regime. Maybe indirectly, maybe directly. We will have to see. But what else can I say about this?
What does this leave Yulia, the wife of Alexei Navalny, in terms of her position moving forward as a figurehead for the anti-government stance in Russia?
Well, I think it's natural for Navalny team to hand over the reins to his widow. Well, but it's now depends on her. What is she going to offer to people? Whether there will be some new ideas, how to move forward, or some new ways how to struggle, or they will be the same. They will just stay the course of Alexei Navalny and his team that they have been pursuing for the last 3 years, at least, and which proved to be not very successful. We still have to see.
Let's talk about what the UK has just announced in the last couple of hours. They've announced that the assets of 6 chiefs of the Russian penal colony where Mr. Navalny died have had their assets frozen. Is this a move in the right direction by the UK? Do you expect other countries to do so? And does this kind of thing make a difference?
Well, I'm 99% sure that this will make no difference. I have some doubts that these people had the assets in the UK. Maybe they did, okay. But to freeze it, it does nothing in order to prevent further crimes, okay? Because they are in Russia, they all work in this system, they are bound by its rules, informal rules, and so they will be doing whatever they are told to by their superiors. And for instance, recently we have a case of former Crimean governor, Sevastopol governor, Mr. Ovsyannikov, governor from Russian side, who turns out to be a UK citizen. That's another question. Why UK authorities gave its citizenship to someone who was working in annexed Crimea as the head of the Sevastopol, right? Okay. So I just want to underscore that the Western sanction policy is not very consistent.
OK. Boris Bondarev, it's good to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's return to that breaking news story. The King has met the Prime Minister face to face for the first time since his cancer diagnosis. Let's cross live now to our royal correspondent, Daniela Ralph. And good news for the King, at least. He's now meeting people face to face.
Yes, that's right. This is a really important moment. Understandably, we haven't seen much of the King in recent weeks since his cancer diagnosis. Buckingham Palace had always said he'd be doing some duties, but to date we have had evidence of that. We have seen the King and the Prime Minister hold one of their regular weekly audiences here in the private audience room at Buckingham Palace. Cameras were allowed in to film the very beginning of that meeting, and we could hear a little bit of the chat between the two men as well. We could hear the King saying that he had received some wonderful cards and messages. As he put it, some of them had reduced him to tears. They also talked about the fact that by going public with his cancer diagnosis, that had been a very positive, helpful public health message as well. So a little bit of the chat we could sneakily hear. But as you say, the two men hadn't met in person since before Christmas. And today was very much our first chance to see the King up close and at work since his cancer diagnosis. Now, we also know that earlier today, the King attended a meeting of the Privy Council, which is a meeting where he formally approves various bits of government business. So if we put all that information into the mix, the audience and the Privy Council meeting, it seems to suggest that the King is coping very well with his cancer treatment.
Daniela Ralph, thank you very much indeed for that. I'm back with more news on the World Today with Maryam Moshiri in a few minutes' time. Stay with us on the BBC.
Hello there. Some changes to come with the weather story in South America over the next few days. If we take a look at the pressure chart, we've got a series of cold fronts that are gradually moving their way north and east across Chile and Argentina. That's going to introduce fresher air, so those heatwave conditions we've been seeing will start to ease somewhat. It'll also bring some rain as well, moving slowly northwards across Argentina over the next few days. Some heavy rain still expected across southeast Brazil. That could have an impact here, but generally the rainfall across northern Brazil quieter. Few scattered showers, some of those quite heavy across that west coast of Venezuela and into Ecuador. So we'll need to keep an eye on that. That rain across southern Brazil could cause some issues. That's the frontal system across Argentina, and then behind it we've got that cooler air. So the story then continues over the next few days. The sharp showers will gradually ease across Rio de Janeiro. Buenos Aires will see those temperatures falling away from the 30s down into the mid-20s. Mexico looks largely fine and quiet. In fact, the bulk of Mexico, Central America and the Caribbean largely quiet at the moment. Temperatures a little bit subdued, down on where they should be for the time of year, but they are going to start to improve over the next few days. But there's no significant rainfall, few scattered showers, as you can see, over the next few days, but also lots of sun.
It's really disheartening to see this amount of waste come forward. If it wasn't for us collecting them, they'd go to landfill or incineration.
I feel very proud. I want to encourage other black athletes to take up swim, bike, run and dream of becoming champions.
В війні все одно, хто ти, чоловік або жінка. Коли ракета потрапляє в будинок, а ракеті все одно, чоловіки, там жінки або діти помирають всі.
Inspiring short films from the BBC.
When the weather can't make up its mind, we can help you make up yours. Check on BBC Weather.
Now showing on BBC Real.
A woman called Tyra is mentioned on the two Yellingstones as the mother of Harold Bluetooth and the wife of Gorm the Old. But there's also another Queen Tyra who's mentioned on some other runestones in this area. And it's been a discussion. Who is she? Is that the same woman?
All of a sudden we have more runestones for this one woman than any male person has ever had. And that tells us something in itself. I suspect she is the main protagonist in actually developing the Yelling dynasty.
We usually say that the royal line starts with Gorm the Old. Now I would rather say that the royal line started with Gorm and Tyra.
Watch more stories like this at bbc.com/real.
This is The World Today with Maryam Moshiri on BBC News. The headlines. The Israeli parliament votes to support Prime Minister Netanyahu's declaration opposing the unilateral creation of a Palestinian state. A large number of Russian troops are believed killed in an apparent Ukrainian strike on a Russian army training site in the occupied Donetsk region.
Throw your keys up, stick around.
And Beyoncé becomes the first black woman to top the US Billboard Hot Country chart with her latest song, Texas Hold'em. Well, let's start with the latest from Ukraine, where at least 60 Russian troops have been killed after a training area in the occupied eastern region was hit by 2 missiles. Sources have told the BBC that the troops have been gathered for the arrival of a senior commander. It comes just days before this week's second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Take a look at this map. It shows Ukrainian territory before the invasion, where Crimea, in red, had been annexed by Russia, and parts of eastern Ukraine, in yellow, were under the control of Russian separatist groups. We'll fast forward to today, and we can see Russia's advancement in the east, including the recent capture of the Avdiivka after some of the fiercest fighting of the war. Well, neither country releases their total death tolls, but there have been heavy losses on both sides. Well, let's cross live now to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, who joins us live from Kyiv this evening. And Lise, tell us more about the deaths of these Russian soldiers in this training ground.
Yes, Maryam, all of the reports from the occupied Donetsk region of eastern Ukraine said, as you heard in the headlines, that dozens were killed, possibly as many as 60. There is video from that area showing a large number of dead soldiers on the ground. Russia has responded to those reports, admitting that there were strikes on that area as the soldiers stood in an open field waiting for a senior commander to arrive. But they said the casualty figures were grossly exaggerated. Russian media are also saying that that attack, which they haven't reported in detail, took place just before Russia's Vladimir Putin had a meeting with his defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and that incident wasn't mentioned, according to the Russian reports. But the recent capture of Avdiivka in roughly around the same area in Donetsk, Russia's biggest military success for about a year now, was discussed, not surprisingly.
Lise, it is coming up now to the 2-year anniversary of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. You were there then, you're there now. What is it that you see that's changed over the last 2 years in Kyiv? And what do the people in Kyiv tell you about how they feel 2 years down the line?
No one will forget those fateful hours in the dark of night on February the 24th, where, much to the disbelief and shock of so many, including many here in Ukraine, Russia attacked by land, sea and air. And no one will forget that military analysts the world over said it would just be a matter of days before Russian tanks rumbled here into the heart of the Ukrainian capital. And beyond all expectations, Ukrainian forces stood up and managed to secure some military successes, pushing back Russian forces from the outskirts of Kyiv about a month later, by the end of March. But fast forward now to the 2-year mark, and it is a very, very tough scene on the battlefield. After their victory at Avdiivka, the Russian forces are now said to be advancing on front lines from at least 5 directions. President Zelensky visited the front lines. He said the situation is extremely difficult, and he made a point of mentioning that Russia, he says, is taking advantage of the delays in that desperately needed military assistance from the United States to try to secure advantages on the battlefield. That $61 billion in a security package being held up in the US Congress. This year is not going to be just extremely difficult military battles, but it is also going to be the year of political battles, as President Zelensky and his team battles to keep the West with sending that arms and ammunition that it desperately needs to continue this fight.
Lise, thank you very much indeed. Lise Doucette there live in Kyiv for us. Well, let's take you just very briefly live to the House of Commons in Westminster, because, as we said to you earlier, we had been preparing to follow a vote on a motion in Parliament put forward by the Scottish National Party calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Now, earlier, the House Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, had chosen both the government and the Labour Party amendments to the motion. That was controversial because it broke convention on not selecting opposition amendments. Well, since then, in the last 20 or so minutes, the government has withdrawn its own amendment. So Labour's amendment could now pass. The Leader of the Commons, Penny Mordaunt, told MPs the government will, in her words, play no further part in today's proceedings. She added that the government's position in Israel remained unchanged. This then suggests the government's amendment to the SNP motion will not now go in for a vote. So really, there is a bit of chaos, I think, is the right word to describe it, in Parliament. We are now waiting to see what happens next. We'll try and bring you the very latest on this debate as and when we get it. Well, let's continue now with our own coverage of the Israel-Gaza war, after Israel's parliament overwhelmingly voted to back Prime Minister Netanyahu's declaration opposing the unilateral creation of a Palestinian state. His Likud party says 99 out of 120 members voted to support the declaration passed earlier this week by the Israeli cabinet. This all comes amid growing international pressure to revive efforts to reach a two-state solution to the decades-long conflict. This is what the Israeli Prime Minister had to say after the result was announced.
The people of Israel and their elected representatives are united today as never before. The Knesset voted overwhelmingly to oppose any attempt to unilaterally impose a Palestinian state on Israel. Such an attempt will only endanger Israel and will prevent the genuine peace that we all seek. Peace can only be achieved after we achieve total victory over Hamas and through direct negotiations between the parties, direct negotiations without preconditions.
Well, let's speak now to Daniel Levy. He's president of the US Middle East Project, founded by the Council of Foreign Relations. He's also a former Israeli negotiator with the Palestinians under multiple Israeli prime ministers. Daniel, good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us on The World Today. Your reaction to that vote, unsurprising, I guess, that there was consensus between members of the Knesset on this particular point.
Yes, Maryam, not surprising. What I think we can derive from this is, first of all, unfortunately, if the vote had been about opposition to a Palestinian state in itself, you would probably still have had an overwhelming support for no Palestinian state. That's the position of the Israeli governing coalition and of some of the opposition. So the Israeli position is, from the river to the sea, there will only be a Jewish state. That's a hugely problematic thing to work with. The other thing we can draw from this is that the approach of the US administration, which seems to be that we will back Israel in the war, provide the weapons for the war to keep going, but at the same time, try and do two things. Try and influence the flow of the war, if you like, prevent what could be an even worse catastrophe in Rafah, and try and stir up an internal debate in Israel around potential recognition with no real meaning to it, just as a rhetorical thing, of a Palestinian state, and around a possible normalization deal with Saudi. The idea that this is going to shift the Israeli political equation is highly misplaced. It really is a demonstration that the Biden administration has got its strategy all wrong. And if it wants to impact the trajectory of developments, get an end to this, get an end to its own embarrassing carrying of the can for this, including with another veto in the UN Security Council, put an end to the problems this is causing to Biden in his re-election campaign, then they will have to take a different approach and use a different kind of leverage, the kind of leverage they have been highly reluctant to use.
OK, Daniel, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us here on The World Today.
Thank you.
Let's take you live now to the House of Commons. This is the scene now in the House. We've heard in the last minute or so that the SNP and Conservative MPs have walked out of the Commons chamber in an apparent protest over the Speaker's handling of this Gaza ceasefire debate. And now a big row has erupted over amendments to a motion which was initially put forward by the Scottish National Party calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The government, after amendments were accepted from the Labour Party by the Speaker, said it will play no further part in a vote on the Labour Party amendment to the motion. So, it's been described in the last few minutes as complete and utter chaos. To bring a little bit of sense to the chaos, let's cross live now to Peter Saul. That's quite a big thing to ask of you, Peter, but I'm sure you are going to rise to the challenge. What is happening?
Yeah,
Explain.
I mean, it is utterly bonkers what has just happened in the past hour or so here in the Houses of Parliament. The latest is that MPs are now voting on whether to sit in private, so that would then enable them to find a way through this almighty mess now. Remember, this was all about, first and foremost, agreeing a position on whether or not there should be an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. That was a motion that was brought forward by the Scottish National Party. The Speaker then allowed an amendment put forward by the Labour Party to be debated and voted on first. So that was supposed to be what was happening initially, but that angered both the SNP and the Conservatives. And so just as we were about to go towards the vote on that initial Labour amendment, we had the Leader of the House of Commons, Penny Mordaunt, Conservative minister, standing up and saying that they weren't happy and actually that they were going to pull out of the process, unhappy with the fact that the Speaker had broken convention to do this. His argument was that it was all about providing MPs with all of the different choices there so they express their opinions on exactly the different motion that they saw fit. So because the Conservatives effectively pulled out of the process, that means that the Labour amendment will probably pass because the SNP have said that they're going to vote for it too, and that means that we would not then get a vote on the SNP motion. And that matters because this is supposed to be an Opposition Day debate in the name of the Scottish National Party, and they say that now that has been taken away from them because of this row about parliamentary procedure. Meanwhile, there are hundreds of people protesting outside Parliament, calling for free Palestine, for a ceasefire now. They're probably scratching their heads, as indeed are indeed I'm sure a lot of voters up and down the UK, as to what on earth is happening in our Parliament this evening.
And we've heard, haven't we, that the row erupted earlier, as you mentioned, over these amendments. But it all started off as quite a normal debate, didn't it?
It did, yeah, and we saw MP after MP making arguments that we've heard an awful lot, really, since the October the 7th attack and the conflict that has since broken out. Actually, if you look at the wording of the individual motions, or the motion and the amendments that have been put forward by the three biggest parties in Westminster, there wasn't a great deal between them. They were all calling for an end to the fighting. They were all saying that there was a need to get aid into Gaza. They were all saying that the prospect of a ground offensive in Rafah by the Israelis was of deep concern, but they were slightly tonally different, really. The SNP was a much more straightforward call for an immediate ceasefire. Labour are saying, well, the conditions for that, of course, are that both sides lay down their arms. The government amendment, which, as I say now, is not going to be voted on at all, was calling for an immediate humanitarian pause, and they were stressing Israel's right to self-defence. So there were some slight differences of opinion there, but really the House is on largely the same page on this, that the fighting needs to stop. But it was only ever going to be a kind of advisory vote, of course. What Parliament thinks here in the UK may increase international pressure on the two different actors in the war in the Middle East right now. But this was not binding on anyone, really. But what it has happened now is just descended into this almighty ruckus about centuries-old parliamentary procedure. We've had the SNP calling on the House of Commons Speaker to come back in and explain himself. In the event, we had his deputy, Dame Rosie Winterton, trying to explain what on earth was happening, trying to find a way through. We'll wait now as to whether MPs think that they should sit in private, so we won't be able to watch that proceeding, and they'll try to work out a way forward. But no sign of any votes at all, really, on this very, very important issue.
So there's no voting going on at all? There's no at the moment?
There's a vote at the moment, I'm told, on whether Parliament should sit in private. So that would mean we'd have to turn the cameras off, and within the House of Commons chamber, they would try to work a way forward. But this is very, very rare indeed. I can't think of a time that this has happened in my years covering politics here in Westminster. There's an awful lot of journalists here in Central Lobby between the Commons and the Lords scratching their heads as to what on earth is going on.
We've been hearing just that the Deputy Speaker, Rosie Winterton, responding to the SNP's Brendan O'Hara and the comments saying that this has descended into absolute chaos, said that this looks bad to our constituents when MPs are just shouting each other down. How much shouting has there been?
Yeah, I mean, a lot, really. And, yes, this happens in the House of Commons. It's an adversarial chamber where, debates happen on a day-to-day basis, where passions can run high. But this evening, an awful lot of finger wagging, rounds of applause in support, which is very unusual. You don't often get applause in the House of Commons in support of points that have been made by individuals. And in the middle of it all, Dame Rosie Winterton, as I say, is the Deputy Speaker. It wasn't her job to actually decide what was going to happen with the voting on these amendments today, trying to work out a way forward and sort of defend the decision that Lindsay Hoyle had made. But he is under an awful lot of pressure now. We've had one Conservative MP tabling what's called an early day motion of no confidence in the Speaker of the House of Commons. Now, quite whether that goes anywhere, we'll have to wait and see. But certainly this evening, an awful lot of noise and very little clarity.
Tell me a little bit more about this current vote, because I'm just hearing that the Deputy Speaker and MPs have started to leave the Commons. They're saying that MPs will now vote on whether the Commons should sit in private. If they do vote to sit in private, what happens next?
Well, who knows, to be honest. I guess what they will do then is discuss a way forward. Now, the SNP are saying, well, their amendment should be, or their motion, as was, should be voted on first because it is their Opposition Day debate. They are entitled to a certain number of Opposition Day debates throughout the course of the year, as are the Labour Party, as the largest opposition party too. So Maybe they decide to defer the votes to another day. That was the suggestion of one MP just now in the points of order. Maybe they decide they are going to proceed but do it in a slightly different order. There's some politics at play, of course, here too, because there are differences of opinion within the Labour Party. The last time there was a vote on whether there should be an immediate ceasefire, dozens of Labour MPs rebelled, backed the SNP motion. We also had several Labour frontbenchers resigning. Since then, the Labour position has morphed, really, to call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, which I think is something that largely the party was happy to get on board with. Keir Starmer pretty content that he was going to avoid a major rebellion this evening. But if that SNP amendment or SNP motion were to be voted on first, then potentially that puts Labour MPs in a difficult position once again as to whether they should vote for that more straightforward call for an immediate ceasefire. Who knows what they're going to decide in the next few minutes or so. That vote's still happening. MPs still traipsing through the aye and the no lobbies as they work out a way forward.
Peter, I'm going to give you a break. You need it. And we're just going to play a clip to the audience of Tory and SNP voters and MPs leaving the chamber. Have a look at this. There's no sound. I wish there were sound. If there were sound, you'd hear the absolute chaos that Peter was talking about there as SNP, Scottish National Party, and Conservative MPs left the chamber. There was a lot of anger amongst MPs. They were all, as we said earlier, voting on the amendments put forward by the Conservative and Labour Party. The Conservatives then withdrew their amendment. You can see there, they're just walking out. They're just filing out one by one in these pictures. I think, can we at some point go back to Peter? I wanted to ask Peter, I know this is putting pressure on you again, Peter, but is there anyone there you can talk to, any MPs behind you?
Yeah, I mean, they're all starting to file out
now.
Who
are those people behind you?
Yeah, well, so a lot of these are, I think, parliamentary staffers, to be honest. Some of the MPs starting to go back in there now. They will have voted. I'm actually standing next to the Foreign Office Minister, Andrew Mitchell.
Can you
who's
grab
about
him?
to speak.
Can you grab him in a polite manner?
He's about to speak to a rival broadcaster, so I don't want to...
Oh, that's not good enough, Peter. Come on.
Handle him away. But yeah, we'll obviously work out if we can get some MPs to speak to here and try and get a sense of what is actually happening, what they're being told to do in this vote, whether there is indeed a whipping operation on whether or not the House should sit in private, and then whether there is some school of thought as to whether they can find a way forward on the various different votes to do with this, with calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza.
Peter, of course, I would never condone you grabbing anyone physically, so don't worry about that. I'm just hearing now that this move that the Chamber is doing, this vote to decide on whether to continue the sitting in private, as you mentioned, is a very rare move. Apparently, I'm reading here, it last happened by accident more than 2 decades ago. It means basically all members of the public must leave, broadcasting of proceedings ends, and the official record Hansard does not produce a transcript, of what MPs say. However, the results are published.
Right, OK, so we'll wait and see if and when that happens. It would, as you say, be something utterly extraordinary, something I've never come across in my time covering politics. I don't know whether as a journalist I would still be able to go into the public gallery or the press galleries I regularly am to watch sittings, or whether it is only open to members of Parliament, elected members of Parliament, that private sitting. But as you say, though, it sounds like there will be some record of it taken and then published at a later stage. But presumably we'll get some indication from the MPs as they file in and out of the chamber as to what is going on in there, and also maybe them trying to work out what, as the individual parties in Parliament, they're being told to do. Difficult one for the whips, I guess, as well. They'll be having to corral everyone into doing something en masse. We just don't know what is going to happen here, frankly.
It just feels, doesn't it, to people watching, this was supposed to be a debate on a really, really serious issue on what's happening in Gaza, the aid to Gaza, the war in Gaza between Israel and Gaza, and it just feels, doesn't it, for the audience, I'm sure, viewers watching this, that this is supposed to be a serious debate that feels like it's just descended into some sort of farce, quite frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and several MPs have stood up in the debate and said that Parliament has not been painted in a very good light at all today. It is a very, very serious issue. It's something that millions and millions of people care about, as evidenced by the protests that have taken place outside Parliament today. In fact, there was what's called a mass lobby, so lots of pro-Palestinian demonstrators queuing up, spending hours in the rain here in Westminster, trying to get in to Parliament so they could lobby, speak to their MPs directly. And I saw earlier on in Westminster Hall, which is the oldest part of Parliament, people writing individual notes to their MPs, and then I saw some of those notes being carried into the chamber and being passed to MPs for their consideration. So MPs well aware of the fact that this is something that people care a great deal about. And actually, the point has also been made about MPs' security here. You know, they want to be able to express their views. Some of them feel like on this particular issue, because it has been quite divisive, that at times that the pressure from voters has been too much to bear. But tonight, yeah, for everyone looking at these scenes of utter chaos in the House of Commons, yeah, it's difficult to see how many people would take a good view of it, really.
Peter, as we watch these live pictures of what is happening in the House of Commons, I can still see people milling around behind you, so if you do spot anyone, do let me know. We talked about what potentially it means if there is a vote for them to sit in private, but what does it mean if there isn't? Do we then go back to what we had before, or what happens?
Yeah, presumably they will then go back to a public sitting and point of order after point of order, trying to find a way through. Or they might decide at that point that they are now going to go and actually vote on the Labour amendment to the SNP motion, which was the plan certainly a few hours ago anyway, and because the Conservatives have said that they're not going to take part in that, you would expect that motion to pass, and that would then mean that the original SNP motion would not be voted on. But really that is what has caused this row in the first place. The SNP saying, well, that is not how this should work. Convention has been thrown out by the House of Commons Speaker. Not clear where he is at the moment. It might be that he returns to explain himself. That has